great difficulty of the problem concerning the erection of a civil constitution is that man is an animal which demands right and still does not like to grant anybody else his right, which therefore requires a master, who, however, also can only ever be a man. From such crooked wood no Mercury can be carved. Immanuel Kant. When discussing theories of states, right, one important question is who should run the state and how should it be run? How should the state be structured? Now, for Kant, one important point here is that he makes a distinction between ruling and governing, and therefore to him there's also a distinction between the form of the state, of which there are three, determining who rules, either one monarch or a senate of aristocrats or the people in democracy. And on the other hand, to Kant, there is the form of government, which is not about who rules, but about how they rule, which can, according to Kant, happen either in a despotic or in a republican manner. Now, I already discussed this distinction of ruling and governing in my previous lecture. It is quite important and it will also help better understanding this lecture, so I do advise to first check out the previous lecture. And as for the forms of government, as for despotism and the republic, those I will discuss in an upcoming lecture. Here I want to first talk more about the structure of the state. And to Kant, it is important that the state has the monopoly of power. That's kind of the whole point. I already talked about this in my lecture on why there should even be a state. That the state of nature, when there's no laws, no state, is a state of constant, at least potential war of all against all, that will probably lead to what Kant calls barbarism, that is the rule of the strong, the completely lawless rule of the strong that prey on the weak and subjugate the weak. This we want to prevent. And it can only be prevented if the state alone has power. So if all the power that individuals may have in the state of nature is taken away from them and is given to the state. And this, of course, leads to the problem that if the state has all the power and no individual has power to act against the state could easily turn despotic. A proposed solution for that has always been a system of checks and balances. And here Kant supports the division of powers into three powers that we are also used to today, right? We have the legislative power, the executive power, and the judiciary. Kant, in the 18th century, it is clear that this is a thought that is only emerging. So while Kant usually does make this distinction into these three powers, he does sometimes call the executive power the rectorate, but that's just a different name. In function, it is what today is called the executive branch of power. And he also seems at some points to subsume the executive branch and the judiciary under the title of administration, and to distinguish that from the legislative power. But then there's also points where he seems to distinguish three powers: legislative, executive, but then the third is not the judiciary but the administration, of which the judiciary is part, but which contains more than the judiciary. So it's all still a bit fluctuating and getting worked out. But all in all, especially if you don't look at his notes, but at his late published works, Kant does have the same division of powers that we also talk about today. And of course, that thought is not one that Kant came up with. That is the separation into these three specific powers had already been suggested by the French thinker Montesquieu, whom Kant has read. And Kant takes that thought up from there. What Kant adds, first of all, is his architectonic method, a method that I already discussed in a separate lecture of that title. To Kant, the architectonic is what makes science, and what distinguishes science, scientific cognition, from regular common cognition. So to Kant, the architectonic is really important. He would say that we should not simply look around empirically what we can find in experience, or just look around in our own minds, so to say, think of what we can think up, because speaking of the separation of powers, that is what Montesquieu did, but that would leave the possibility that maybe there could be more powers. So sure, Montesquieu was thinking of three. Maybe he couldn't think of a fourth or a fifth power, but maybe if you thought about it more, you could come up with more powers. So you would never know if this is really the right separation of powers. Well, the architectonic method is about starting from a principle of reason, and from that principle deducing the basic structure, deducing, so to say, the empty slots that there are in your system, so that you know how many you have to fill, so that you know when you are done, and so that you know when you are not done, because there's still a gap, so to say. And the way Kant deduces these three powers is that, for one, he says they are akin to the three parts of a syllogism. Now, this is something I discussed already in my lecture on what is reason, because reason to Kant is also the faculty of concluding, of drawing conclusions. And a syllogism in classical logics is just that. It is a logical conclusion that contains three parts. It contains a major, that is a general statement, like all human beings are mortal. And then a minor, a specific statement, like Socrates is a human being. And then you draw, third, your conclusion from that. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, this is like the three powers, Kant says. The legislative to him is the major. It makes, makes general laws, and has the job to, through those laws, make sure there is freedom in the state. And then the executive is like the minor that is being subsumed under the major, because it is the executive that, well, executes those laws, right? And then finally, the judiciary is analogous with the conclusion. It is, so to say, drawing the conclusions. It is checking whether the executive has indeed executed the laws in the correct ways, or if it has acted against the laws in some manner. Kant also deduces the three powers from his table of categories. The table of categories is usually at the basis of Kant's architectonic method, because Kant says there are these 12 categories, these 12 basic concepts of our intellect that structure all our thinking. Whatever we are thinking as human beings must happen within these 12 basic thoughts, so to say. And therefore, every thought, like in this case, the thought of the state and the government of the state, can be structured within these categories. I already gave a lecture on the table of categories that helps you better understand them. And I also gave a follow-up lecture about how this table of categories is the key to Kant's whole system, and you cannot truly understand Kant without having understood the table of categories. Now, as for the three powers, they, according to Kant, would correspond to the three categories of relation. So the first of those categories is that of subsistence and inherence, the relation between a thing and its own attributes, like between rose and red, or between sugar and sweet. And this is where the legislative belongs, because through its laws, it first constitutes the state. So it makes up the substance of the state. The second category of relation is that of causality, or of dependence and consequence. And so the relation between one thing and another thing that depends on the first thing, that is caused by the first thing. And that is, of course, where the executive branch belongs, because this is the relation between the state and its subjects, the state sort of being the cause and the people in the state being dependent on it. And then lastly, you have the category of community, or of the whole and the parts, several parts together making up a whole and determining each other's places within that whole. This is where, according to Kant, the judiciary belongs, because through its judgments that it pronounces, the punishments it gives out, and so on, it checks what the West is doing, and it constitutes the community of the citizens within the state. It constitutes the people in the state living together in a harmonious community. But Kant does add more of his own thoughts, besides adding and deducing the three powers from his architectonic method. Namely, as I already said, Kant says the state must have the monopoly of power. So here he follows Hobbes and agrees with Hobbes. Hobbes, really the first of those modern thinkers of statehood, of right, Hobbes had called the state the Leviathan. This, of course, is a biblical monster originally. And on the cover of Hobbes' book under the title, there was a quote from the Bible. A quote about this monster. Non est potestas supra terram que comparatur e. So there is no power on earth which would compare to it. Meaning, in the Bible, God is saying, well, I am above this monster, but here on earth, the Leviathan is the strongest being there is. No one can resist him. And this Hobbes said, this is how the state must be like. Now, to Kant, this means if we add the separation of powers, which Hobbes did not have in mind, then this means that each of the three powers in its respective area must be the highest power there is, must be a power that cannot be overpowered. So if we go backwards, starting with the judiciary, that means that the judgments, the rulings of the judges of the judiciary must be unchangeable or unappealable, Kant says. Because if you could appeal a judgment, that would mean that the final judgment is not with that judge. If it is with whatever power you can turn to appeal that judgment. And that is indeed how we do it today, right? Of course, this does not go for any small court. And that's also not what Kant is saying. He's not saying that no judgment ever must be appealed. Of course, you can appeal a regular judge's judgment by turning to a court of appeal, turning to a higher court. But then maybe this court, if it doesn't rule in your favor, you can also appeal that court's judgment, and so on and so on. But there must be an end to that chain. And usually in our modern states, that end would be whatever the highest court is, right? The Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court or whatever you call it in your country. But that's the end. You can turn to that court. You can say, okay, injustice has been done to me. Judges have ruled against me, but that was unconstitutional. You must help me. But then if that highest court is not ruling in your favor, that's it. And that must be it. Because again, if you could appeal even that court's decision, then it would not be the highest court. Then whatever other court you can turn to appeal it would be the highest court. Like here, for example, I live in Germany. Sure, our highest court is the Constitutional Court, which you can turn to if you think something is unconstitutional. You could say that since we are in the EU, there is something even beyond that. There's a European Court for Human Rights. Or you could even say, you could maybe argue that since we also are part of the UN, we are part of the International Court, and we are also subscribing to the Rome Statute, meaning to the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court is explicitly there to persecute criminals, like war criminals, that cannot be persecuted in their own countries, maybe because the countries don't function because of civil war, or they don't want to persecute them because they are part of the war crimes. But then that's it, right? There's nothing above that. And there cannot possibly be something above the highest court, because then that would be the highest court. So the judiciary's, at least the final decision, must be unappealable if the state is to have the power and not someone else. Second, the executive branch must be irresistible, Kant says. That is, it must be able to enforce whatever it wants. Of course, should not enforce whatever it wants arbitrarily. It should enforce the law that is passed by the legislative power, but it must have the power to enforce whatever it wants, because if people within the state would be able to resist the executive, if they had enough power to just not conform with whatever the executive wants to execute, then again, the state would not truly be in power. The state would not have the monopoly of power. So, for example, if you think of the US with their obsession with gun ownership, their obsession with their Second Amendment, Kant would probably say to that that this is them not truly wanting to live in a state. This is them sort of refusing the state and sort of insisting on still living somewhat in the state of nature. And now you could probably go into the historical reasons for that. There are probably several. I mean, we could talk about how the US has been founded somewhat by refugees, by people that many of them were persecuted in Europe because they belonged to some small Protestant sect, and they were fleeing from that, so they have some inherent distrust towards the state. And then, of course, the actual founding of the United States was through rebellion against the central government that was judged to be despotic. So that also probably instilled some distrust towards the state. Then, of course, you have the whole period where there is a central state in Washington, but in large parts of the country, because it is expanding into uncharted territory, it is imperially expanding, people had to kind of fend for themselves, right? Of course, it wasn't quite like the Wild West movies tell us, but still, there were large areas where people were sort of on their own and did not depend on state power, on state police so much. And then largely, of course, you had decades of Cold War that were filled with anti-communist propaganda. And in the American mind to this day, communism or socialism is basically anything that has to do with the state, right? If the state does anything, then that's already communism. Like there are totally those right-wingers that believe that Europe is socialist because we actually have healthcare. But be that as it may, whatever the historical reasons may be, there is this distrust towards the state and this insistence on owning your own weapons, which Kant would call barbaric, because as I described in my lecture on what is justice to Kant, in the state of nature, if there are no laws, people are savages. And if the savages don't just live in lawlessness, but actively refuse the laws. So if you try to bring them laws and they say no thanks, then they turn into barbarians. The barbarian is the person who is against the laws, who wants to refuse the laws. And so this is a barbaric element. And sure, the whole argument is usually, oh, we need the firearms to, once again, like the founding of the US, be able to rebel if the state turns despotic. Well, first of all, this is of course not their true reason. This is just a pseudo argument they use to justify the gun ownership when they want to own them for other reasons. I mean, we can see right now that the US is turning despotic, and I don't see the gun owners stopping it. And in fact, even if they tried, which they won't, I don't see how they could stop it. You don't stop government with a modern army, with a ragtag band of people with regular guns. That's not how it works. But in this argument, there's once again expressed this distrust towards the state, and Kant would say this argument makes no sense. If you want to retain the power to stop the state if it turns despotic, then that means the state has no real power. Then that means you must be stronger than the state in order to be able to stop it. And then you could turn despotic. So, sure, Kant is against despotism, but he would say there needs to be some other mechanism against it. Like the division of powers, like the checks of balances within the state, but not the people being able to resist the state. No, the state as such must be, through its executive branch, irresistible, which of course is an argument against private ownership of guns. And lastly, the decisions of the judiciary must be unappealable. The measures of the executive must be irresistible. The laws of the legislative must be irreprehensible. That is, the legislative must in a way be perfect, even holy. Other parts of the state can be reprehensible, Kant would say. Like the executive, if the executive does something wrong that is against the law, well, then you can always complain about it. You can always sue them, right? So if, let's say, the police is too brutal, if the police unjustly kills someone, of course that is bad. And of course, ideally, that shouldn't happen. But then also, ideally, you could, if, let's say, you were beaten up by police in a demonstration, or if, let's say, someone was killed by the police unjustly, ideally, you could turn to the courts, and the courts could punish the responsible policeman. But this would, of course, happen according to the law. The court would rule, okay, the police here acted against the law. But what about the law itself? You can, of course, not simply say that the law is against the law. So this is why the law needs to be irreprehensible. This is why it needs to be perfect. Because otherwise, all actions in the state, even the actions committed by the state, by the government, can be always judged as being against the law and therefore unjust. But you cannot judge the law itself to be against the law and therefore unjust. Again, this is like with the rulings of the judiciary. Of course, the ruling of a specific small judge could be appealed. You could turn to the higher court, but at least the highest courts of all cannot be appealed. The same is true with the laws. Of course, a specific law might be unconstitutional, so you could turn to your Supreme Court, to your Constitutional Court, and complain about that law. And then the court could rule that this law must be abolished because it is unconstitutional. But the court will rule according to a higher law, namely according to the Constitution. So at least the highest law of all, the law by which the other laws are judged, must be irreprehensible. If that law itself was somehow unjust, there's nothing really that could be done within the state. Of course, maybe you could start a revolution or something, but ideally that shouldn't be necessary. So ideally, at least the highest laws, at least the Constitution, must be irreprehensible. And this is very important to Kant. The demand that the laws be perfect, be holy even, be like they were God-given, is a demand that he always comes back to in his philosophy of right. This is a topic that he keeps thinking about. How can we make sure that the laws are irreprehensible? And of course, this is something that today people might criticize, might say is unrealistic, is not possible. But Kant would say it is necessary, and therefore we have to ask how we can make it possible. And here, first of all, this leads us to Kant's theory of sovereignty, because first of all, you need to understand that while Kant is for a separation of powers, he is not saying that the three powers are equal. Rather, he is saying one power must be the overlord. Overlord is a direct translation of what he says in German. He says Oberherr. So I will note that in German the word sounds a bit more normal. It has no further connotations, while at least to me, I don't know how it is to a native speaker, to me overlord sounds a bit funny in English because it sounds like it's taken from some science fiction movie or something. But yeah, there must be an overlord in the state, Kant says, the summus imperans, as he calls it in Latin. And that overlord would have the sovereignty. I mean, that is what sovereign means. It comes from superanus, which means above all, above everything. So the one power that is above everything else. And this sovereign to Kant has several jobs. First off, outwardly, he should be responsible for the defense of the state, defending the state against other states. And second, inwardly, the sovereign has the job of instituting the executive and judiciary powers, so putting the government and putting the judges in place. And he also has the job of inspection, so he needs to check, are these two other branches doing their job right, and if not, then maybe they need to be replaced. Maybe there need to be other people in the government, or maybe there need to be other judges. But besides this, besides outer defense and besides institution and inspection of government and of courts, the sovereign has the legislative power. His job is to give the laws. And I'm speaking about the sovereign in the singular now, so I want to note that it doesn't necessarily need to be one person. This is precisely what the form of state is about to count. The form of state determines who a state's sovereign is. So who has this job of defense, of institution and inspection, and most of all of lawgiving. And here, as I already said, there's the classical three possibilities. So in a monarchy, that is in an absolute monarchy, the sovereign would be the monarch. But in an aristocracy, the sovereignty would lie with the Senate. And in a democracy, the sovereign would be the people. So this, who is the sovereign, this is a separate question that we can put aside here. Here I'm talking about the sovereign not as an actual, but rather as a legal person. So I'm not necessarily talking about a single monarch. It could also be the people. But whoever the sovereign is, again, he has these jobs, right? He puts in place and he inspects the government, for example, right? Again, if it's a monarch, then the king decides who is his minister, and the king gets to replace the ministers if he's not content with them. If it's a democracy, then the people may elect their government, may elect their ministers, and they inspect them, of course, and if they are not content with them, then at the next election they might replace them. But whoever the sovereign is, he has, well, the sovereignty, meaning the highest power, meaning he is the overlord and he is above the other powers. And this is something that people, when first hearing it, might disagree with nowadays, because isn't the whole point of the separation into these three powers that there be no highest power? That according to the concept of checks and balances, the three powers keep each other in check, making sure that none of them can take over the state and turn despotic. Well, to this Kant would respond that there simply needs to be a highest power. There simply needs to be an overlord. Because if there were two powers that are equally great, none of them greater than the other, then neither of them would be literally the overlord, the one who is lord over the other. And that could work for a while, to be sure. But what if there's a conflict between those two equally high powers? If there's a conflict between the powers and there's not one amongst them who can simply overrule the others because it is the higher power, then the only way to resolve that conflict would be through war. And then you would have a sort of civil war, and then you would turn back to the state of nature. So when you had no state, when you had no laws, and when there was a war of all against all, and when not what is right and just decided what happens, but rather whoever is the strongest would win out. So the whole point of the state is to end this state of nature, to prevent this war of all against all and this barbaric rule of the strongest. So therefore, Kant would say it cannot be that there are several powers who are equally strong and who, if they were to disagree, if there was a conflict to arise, would just have to fight a war against each other. No, there must be one power that has the final say. And if you accept that argument, then I think you would have to agree that this power that gets to have the sovereignty could only be the legislative power. Because the executive is supposed to execute according to the laws, right? If the executive power did not have to follow the laws, so if the legislative power was not above the executive but the other way around, then the laws would be pointless, right? If, for example, the police could do whatever they wanted, then why would you need laws? Then that would mean that effectively, even if there was a law book that said something, effectively the police would be making up their own laws on the spot. And likewise, the judiciary is supposed to make judgments, once again, according to whatever is the law. If the judiciary was not bound by the state's laws, if a judge could just judge arbitrarily, even if it is against the law, then again, the law would not just be powerless, it would be entirely pointless, because essentially the judge would be the lawgiver. So you cannot have a division of powers unless the legislative is the highest power. Because if the executive is the highest or the judiciary is the highest power, then they would, at least effectively, even if not in name, be the true legislative power. They, through their arbitrary decisions, would then choose whatever is the law. If you want the legislative to be independent, you need the others to be bound by the legislative's laws, and that means you need the legislative to be the highest power. And that is the whole point to Kant of the separation of powers, right? You are separating the executive, the judiciary, to make sure that they don't make up their own laws on the spot, but rather they follow the laws that are given to them by the legislative power. And if you think about it, I think you will find that this is indeed how we do it in modern democratic states. Now, of course, you can take a specific law of the legislative power and you can go to your constitutional or Supreme Court and complain about that law. And if the court rules that it is unconstitutional, then it must be abolished. This might make it look as if the legislative power was not sovereign, as if it was not a higher power than the judiciary, because it seems that in this case the judiciary is above the legislative, right? Parliament passed some law, but the Supreme Court judges say no, that law is not valid because it's unconstitutional. But this shouldn't fool you, because you have to remember that the judges cannot rule arbitrarily, but rather the judges will judge this specific law according to the Constitution. So once again, according to higher laws, not according to simply their own opinion. So you could say that what we did in the days since Kant is sort of a little and indeed quite clever trick we sort of separated the legislative power into two parts again. You could say that there's the day-to-day legislation, so to say, the executive or the administrative legislation. And you could say that on the other hand, there is, or at least there was, the fundamental constitutional legislation. And so you can say that, sure, the day-to-day administrative legislation is not sovereign. It is not fully above the other powers, and its laws are not fully irreprehensible. Rather, it and its laws can be judged, but they are judged according to the Constitution, so according to the laws of the constitutional legislative. So it is that constitutional legislative, the people that originally made the Constitution, whatever you call them in your country, whether it's the National Council or the original National Congress, whatever they are called, but the original givers of the Constitution, they at least, even if not the day-to-day parliament, were truly sovereign lawgivers. That is, everything is judged according to the laws they gave, and everything has to happen according to the laws they gave, but their laws themselves cannot be judged. So, for example, here in Germany, the first article of our constitution is that human dignity must not be harmed. Now, all other laws must be judged by that. So there is a constitutional court. If you think that some law attacks you in your dignity, then you can turn to that court. And maybe the court will abolish that law. But you could not turn to the constitutional court to complain about that law itself. Right? Because how would that work? I mean, either you would have to say the law that human dignity must not be harmed harms human dignity, which would be an absurd statement, or you would have to say that it harms some other principle which you think is above it. And sure, it might harm some other principle. For example, our politicians since Merkel say that it is the German reason of state to support Israel's security. And so someone could argue that you cannot have human dignity as the highest principle while supporting a settler colonial apartheid state that is engaged in genocide. If you want to support that state, you will have to act against human dignity, someone could argue. Of course, they are not honest enough to openly argue it like that, but if they were honest, they would have to say that. And that would be right? So yes, the principle of dignity does indeed contradict the support of Israel as the German reason of state. But the point is that dignity is the higher principle, according to the Constitution. You yourself can, of course, be of the opinion that this is a bad constitution, that there should be some higher principle, but there isn't, as far as the Constitution is concerned. And so you cannot complain to the Constitutional Court that this principle of dignity violates some other principle. Maybe it indeed violates it, but that doesn't matter because it is the highest principle and not that other principle that it violates. So, yes, in our states, at least the original lawgiver that gave the Constitution is sovereign or was sovereign in the sense of Kant, and its laws, there is no higher power. Everything is judged by that original legislative's laws. but its laws themselves cannot be judged within the state. And in fact, even this division that I made between the original constitutional legislative and the day-to-day administrative legislative, even that division, so even the fact that the day-to-day parliament is not fully sovereign, even that is something that was decided by the sovereign legislative, right? I mean, they did not need to give a constitution. There are states without constitution, and in that case, the regular legislative, the regular parliament would be sovereign. That is, every regular new law that is passed with a simple majority could replace any earlier law and could not be judged as being unconstitutional because there would be no constitution. So every new day-to-day law would have sovereign power. And even the fact that it isn't so is simply because the original constitutional legislative decided that it isn't so. So, we have the sovereignty of the legislative, but this precisely, to Kant, is the crucial problem of the philosophy of right, or at least of the area of state right. Because, again, the sovereign's laws, precisely because they are sovereign, they are above everything, everything is judged by them, but they cannot be judged, need to be irreprehensible, they need to be holy, they need to be perfect. How can this be done? The sovereign himself is human or made up of humans, if it's a senate or if it's the people, and therefore, of course, imperfect, therefore, of course, capable of errors, even if he were to be well-meaning. But even that he is well-meaning can, of course, not simply be guaranteed, right? And that, of course, is a major issue. How do we prevent the sovereign from turning despotic? How do we prevent bad laws, bad execution, bad judgment? Here, at least, we can try to appeal to the law. Here, at least, we can try to have the people judged by the law. We can say this policeman, this judge acted against the law, but bad laws, what can we do? Except, of course, once again, a revolution. This I will discuss in its own lecture, what Kant says, how can the state, if we don't have the perfect state, how can it be improved? But what should we improve it towards? What should the perfect state look like? And there, of course, the issue is that the sovereign is as human as those that he rules. Ideally, the sovereign would have to be a higher being than humans, right? Humans would need to be given laws by someone more perfect than them. So ideally, the sovereign would have to be God. Humans could maybe be trusted with executing the laws of God, but maybe they could not be trusted with giving laws. Which, of course, indeed is what certain fundamentalists would argue, right? Be it the Ayatollahs in Iran, be it the Orthodox fundamentalists in Israel, be it certain evangelicals. And they would precisely argue that there should not be arbitrary laws passed by humans, but rather God's laws should be in place. Of course, Kant does not want the state to function according to the laws laid down in some allegedly holy book. Kant is for a separation of church and state. But one way for him to solve this problem of sovereignty is indeed that he says the sovereign should ideally be religious. Again, no matter who he is, be it a singular monarch, be it a senate of aristocrats, of course, in the democracy, that would then have to mean that everyone would have to be religious. The argument here is that Kant would say, indeed, in a way, God should rule. That is, the state should be ruled by an idea, by the idea of the whole, by the idea of the perfect justice. And God, to Kant, is nothing but the personification of that idea. So, literally, that idea of justice conceived of as realized in a person. And the state itself should realize that idea of justice. So the state, in a way, should be the image, the realization of God. And so whoever is sovereign needs to clearly have that idea in his mind and needs to act, needs to rule, needs to pass his laws according to that idea. And the argument is also that Kant says everyone and everything else in the state is responsible, has to answer to someone else, right? Because everyone else can be judged according to the law. But the sovereign is above the law because he is the one who gives the law. And so therefore the sovereign cannot be judged. The sovereign has to answer to no one within the state. And therefore the sovereign should be someone who feels that he has to answer to somebody higher. If the sovereign is the overlord in the state, he should be someone who believes that there is someone else who is lord even over him. Or again, if we think of the state as the Leviathan, sure, the Bible says there's no power on earth which is comparable to it. But the whole point of the Bible is that, of course, God's power is still above it. So if you don't want the Leviathan, this powerful monster, to crush everything on earth and to rule earth as a tyrant, then it better believe in this higher power of God that it has to answer to. So what Kant is saying is that the sovereign should have a conscience, since he has to answer to nobody else in the state. He needs to answer to his own conscience. And this is what religion means to Kant. I will discuss this further when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion. But religion to Kant is translated as conscientiousness. Religion to Kant is not the same as cult. It does not mean going to a church or mosque. It does not mean praying or following some sorts of arbitrary commandments, but rather it simply means acting as if a holy God was looking at each of your actions as if you could hide nothing from him, and is as if you were being judged by him. And what exactly being conscientious means, that I already discussed in a previous lecture, which I very strongly recommend you to check out. So yeah, Kant asks, while Kant says that within the state there should be freedom of faith, and everyone can believe whatever he wants, and there can even be people who don't believe in God, which was not, I mean, today most people would agree with that maybe, but back in the 18th century that was not a given that somebody said that. While Kant says that the subjects of the state, that the citizens of the state, do not necessarily need to be religious, he does say that at least the sovereign ideally should be religious and should get a religious education, therefore. Which, of course, Kant said in a time of absolutism, of absolute monarchs. But again, if you think of democracy, where the people is the sovereign, that would have to mean that basically everyone gets a religious education and basically everyone is religious. But all of this talk about the sovereign being religious is more of a side note, a small side note that Kant makes. And indeed, if that was all there was to say, it would basically be an admission of defeat, right? Because as soon as you get to religion, you are stepping out of the bounds of philosophy of right. You're now entering the philosophy of religion. So you would say that the philosophy of right can regulate everything else within the state, but that the state itself, and making sure the state is not despotic, cannot be regulated by the right, but only by something higher, by stepping out of the right. And as I said before, in my lecture on politics, what politics should be about, Kant says that ideally the state should be a fully functioning, self-sufficient automaton. Ideally, the state should be built in a way that it does not require its citizens to be angels, but rather it would work even if they were devils, just as long as they are smart devils that care about self-preservation, right? If you have good laws, then okay, maybe everyone is a devil, maybe everyone would like to murder and to steal and to rape, but since they don't want to end up in jail or whatever, they will refrain from doing so. Well, if you now say that the sovereign should be religious because there is no law that can force him, then essentially what you are saying is, in my state, maybe everyone else can be a devil, maybe the state runs well and smoothly and allows for everyone else to be a devil, but at least the sovereign does indeed need to be an angel. And if he happens to be a devil, then the state will not work, then the state will be despotic. This ideally should be avoided. So what else does Kant suggest here? As I said, the sovereign being necessarily holy, irreprehensible, infallible, that is incredibly important to Kant. Kant says that in a way, the sovereign does need to be the custodian of God on earth, or as you would say in Arab, the caliph. Because at the end of the day, the laws should be rational. At the end of the day, it is a demand of reason that there be a state, that there be laws, that there be just laws. And the demand of reason is the same as the demand of God. What is rational is what God wants. God does not want the irrational from us. So in that way, the sovereign, the lawgiver indeed should be the representative of God on earth, and should be as perfect, as incapable of error as God. And this, to Kant, is the reason why there should be a separation of powers. Because the other two powers, the executive and the judiciary, they cannot possibly be perfect, Kant says. They can make errors. So if the sovereign, if the lawgiver was to take part in them. Let's say the sovereign is an absolute monarch, and let's say he not only gives the laws but also acts as the supreme judge, then he could make errors. Because even if you assume that the sovereign is really well-meaning, and again, of course, you cannot necessarily assume that. The sovereign could also be selfish, but even if we assume that he really is well-meaning, he could still make human errors, right? Like a judge that pronounces judgments that punish the criminal, maybe the person he punishes is not guilty. Maybe the judge thinks that someone, let's say, committed a murder, but in fact, the person is innocent. Now, if you have the separation of powers, then that is an error of the specific judge, but it is not an error of the state as such. And maybe this error, maybe you could do something against it, right? Maybe the innocent person could turn to a higher court. Maybe you could try to bring new evidence to prove that person's innocence, and then that person would be let go. And here you would say, okay, this is not an error of the lawgiver, of the sovereign, whether it's the king, whether it's the people, they made no error. They gave just laws. They said, okay, the murderer should be punished and the innocent should be let go. Rather, this was an error of the judge or of the judiciary. They simply misjudged who is guilty and who isn't. But if the sovereign himself were to judge according to his own law, and if he were to make an error, then the error would fall back on the sovereign, and then you could no longer trust the sovereign to be the holy representative of God on earth. So Kant says the only way in which we can try to make sure that the sovereign is perfect is if he never deals with singular or with specific issues or parts of the state. The executive and the judiciary, they deal with specific parts, like with an individual citizen, right? This individual court case is being judged, this individual citizen is being judged whether he's guilty or innocent. And Kant says, once you deal with specific things, once you need to use your power of judgment, on which I already gave an earlier lecture, then you can go wrong as a human being. So we must make sure that the sovereign does never come in direct contact, so to say, with the citizens or with day-to-day matters, but rather the sovereign, not dealing with specific things, only deals with the general. And that we can make sure by having a system where the sovereign is simply the lawgiver, because the laws are general, right? The laws do not address anything or anyone specific, but they are general for all. For example, the general law says no one must murder anyone. Anyone who does murder gets punished. And now the specific case, has this specific person committed this specific murder, and therefore should the law be enacted here or not, that's a separate matter. But the law as such does not deal with the specific case. The law as such is general. And Kant says the only thing that cannot do injustice is a will to itself, right? A will cannot do injustice to itself. I can want to do an injustice to others, but I cannot possibly do an injustice to myself. And therefore, the will of the whole the will of the whole people, not of the majority, not even of the sum of everyone, but rather the united will of the whole of the state, only that is incapable of doing an injustice. So, if the sovereign does not take part in the executive or in the judiciary, if he does not deal with specific matters, but rather if he only deals with the whole by giving general laws, and if he does not do so as himself being a specific person, like for example this individual who happens to be king, because he could of course enact laws that serve his selfish individual interests, but rather if he gives his laws not only for the whole, but also as if they were given by the whole. If he gives laws that represent not his individual will, but the will of the whole, only then can we make sure that the sovereign is always and necessarily just. Because then he gives laws that cannot be unjust, because again, they represent the will of the whole, and they are for the whole, so it is a will giving itself laws, and if you do something to yourself, you cannot do injustice. So this is how it must be, Kant says. And this is precisely the reason why one solution that Kant offers for this problem of sovereignty and of preventing despotism is exactly a very absolute division of powers. Because if we look at the separation of powers nowadays in our states, usually they are not separated fully. Like the judiciary might be pretty independent. So also maybe not fully, because who decides who gets to be judges? Often it's the politicians, right? Like the politicians put the judges at the Supreme Court, at the Constitutional Court in place. So there's no full separation of powers here either. Kant actually says that the people should judge themselves. Again, because you cannot do injustice to yourself. So to prevent that the judges do injustice, there should not be judges arbitrarily placed above the people, but rather the people should judge themselves. Therefore, Kant is for having a jury, as they do, of course, in the Anglo-Saxon system, like as they do in England and nowadays in the US. Here in the continental system of laws, that is not what we usually have. Like nowadays in Germany, we usually don't have a jury, but rather just the judge. Kant, in his day, not only in this point, also in other points, kept looking at England, at the English political system, and there were quite a few elements of it that he approved of and that he would have liked to import, this being one of them. But anyways, the judiciary might be somewhat independent, but in our modern systems, the executive and the legislative powers are often quite mixed up, right? Because the legislative is done by a parliament that gives laws. But in the parliament, you don't have independent parliamentarians. You usually have people that belong to a party. And the government, like the head of government and also the ministers, the state secretaries, usually also belong to parties, and usually they are the leading figures in their parties, and often their party will also be the party that has a majority in the parliament, right? Especially if they are not voted for independently of one another. Like in a system like the US, sure, you vote for the parliament and you vote for the president. So maybe the president belongs to one party and then the other party gets a majority in the parliament. But for example, here in Germany, that is not really possible because we don't vote for the chancellor. We vote for the parliament, and then the parliament votes who gets to be chancellor. So of course the chancellor will be from the party or from the parties forming a coalition that have the majority in parliament. And so and also here the chancellor and the ministers are usually at the same time MPs in the parliament. Like it's not necessary for them to be. Within our system, it is also possible that they aren't, but usually they are. So clearly, there's a mix between executive and legislative. And Kant supports a much more strict separation of powers than we have nowadays. So, once again, the sovereign has the job of instituting and of inspecting the judiciary and also the executive, but he should not take part in it. So the executive, that to Kant is also the government, right? So the executive or the rectorate, as he calls it, would be made up of the ministers, for example, or the state secretaries, and it would be headed by someone whom Kant calls the governor or the rector. So the head of government, whatever you call him in your country, like here it would be the chancellor. In other countries, it would be the prime minister or the grand vizier or whatever. Kant says, by the way, it could even be a king. The king doesn't, if you have a king, the king doesn't need to be a sovereign, right? Sure, in absolutism, the sovereignty is with the king. The king is the lawmaker. But Kant says that in the English system, of course, we are speaking now about the 18th century. Nowadays, in the English system, the king is also not the head of government. The king has much less power now. But in his day, Kant views the English king more as a sort of head of government, who is above the ministers and the prime minister, and who, of course, also has this job of outer defense, of waging wars. But the sovereignty, the law-giving power, is with the parliament. Specifically because the parliament has the power over the money, right? The parliament has to agree on taxes, on budgets. The king cannot just has no sovereign power over his own money. So whatever you call the head of government, this governor or rector, but the point to Kant is that the sovereign puts him and the ministers in place. So if the sovereign is an absolute monarch, sure, he may put ministers and the prime minister in place, or here in Germany, the chancellor. If the sovereign is the people in democracy, they might vote for ministers and again for prime minister or whatever you want to call him. But then the government does its own thing and is separate from the sovereign. Of course, the sovereign gives laws and the government has to govern according to the laws. In Kant's mind, the government cannot pass laws, but it can pass decrees, so executive orders, so to say. And the government is, of course, concerned with how to enact the laws, right? So maybe the sovereign lawgiver says, okay, there should be education in my state, there should be general education, there should be schools. But now the day-to-day business of schooling will be probably the job of the Minister of Education and of his ministry, right? Like they will make sure there are teachers, they make sure there's some sort of education for teachers, like you can study to be a teacher, and there are tests for teachers to make sure that they know what they are doing. And the Minister of Education will probably be responsible for the curricula, so for choosing what specifically should be taught in school, and how the exams should function, right? Not every small detail of that will be determined by the law, but rather this will be determined by decree. So even without the general law that there should be public education changing, the decree could be changed by the government, like the government could make changes to the curricula or whatever. And again, here, errors and injustices could happen, of course. So, because again, we are dealing with specific things. And that is precisely why this must be something that we can complain about. Why, for example, you should be able to go to court and say, okay, there's something wrong here in the school system. This is what's happening here, what's talked here, or whatever is unconstitutional. But the law as such must be irreprehensible. The law as such that does not deal with a specific part of the state, with specific subjects or citizens, but rather that deals with the whole, and should be given, at least in the spirit of the whole, representing the will of the whole. The law should be perfect. And if that can be guaranteed at all, then it can only be guaranteed by the lawgiver completely being separate from the executioners of the law, and not at all taking part in that. So in Kant's mind, the sovereign never deals directly with any part of the state, or with the state and the people at all, but rather only mediated through the government, which acts as a sort of bridge. And it is precisely here where it is so important that Kant distinguishes between ruling and governing, and where I once again advise that you check out my earlier lecture on that topic. Because the sovereign, the lawgiver, to Kant is the ruler, but the government, as the name suggests, and the governor as the head of government, is, well, the governor, the body that governs. And as I explained in that earlier lecture, to Kant, the governing is more important than the ruling. Kant, through a number of analogies, he says, sure, the senses rule in the individual, but the intellect, reason, should govern. So yeah, the senses might say eat or have sex or whatever, but I should not follow that mindlessly and steal my food or rape or whatever, but rather I should let this ruling be governed by reason. And it is precisely in this way that I can make sure that it is never bad, it is never evil, right? It is not so much the ruling itself that is good or bad, but rather it is the question, how is it executed, right? Once again, if the body is horny, if the body demands sex, as a rational being, I can choose whether I rape someone or whether I have consensual sex. And so whatever the ruling is, whatever my senses demand from me, I can sort of filter it, and I can sort of put it in a form, because that is what it is to Kant. The ruler gives the matter, the content, but the government gives it the form. I can sort of put it in a form that makes it good, or that makes it harmless, even if maybe the ruling as such could be harmful. And so this is what should also happen in the state. So if the sovereign lawgiver and the governor are sufficiently separated, then Kant would say we can even have a bad sovereign, a bad lawgiver, but the government could sort of smooth that over, right? So if you have an executive made up of people with a conscience, then they will think about how to follow the sovereign's orders and whether to follow them at all. So think of the biblical story of King Herodes commanding the killing of all the babies because he tries to kill Jesus, but he doesn't know which baby is Jesus, so he just commands them all to be killed. Now, to be sure, he actually wasn't sovereign in the sense of Kant. He was not a sovereign absolute monarch, but rather he was a monarch just by the grace of Rome. The Romans were above him. But we can ignore that here for argument's sake. Let's say he had been sovereign. Now, sure, this commandment as such is an unjust commandment because it is not given as the will of the whole, right? The whole could not want for the babies to be killed because the whole would include the parents of those babies who probably wouldn't want that. So this is clearly, this would clearly be the sovereign abusing his power and acting not as representative of the whole, but rather acting as representative of only himself as an individual and his individual selfish interest, right? He's doing this because it has been prophesied that Jesus will be king of the Jews, so he, being the current king of the Jews, fears for his power. And that is precisely why this is despotic, right? Because he's not representing the whole, but just himself. But if there had been sufficient separation of power, then the king can rule whatever he wants, but he is just the one ruling it. So all he does really is speaking words and nothing else. He is not the one executing his ruling. So he is not the one that gets to go around and kill those babies. So while if he was sovereign, according to Kant's theory, you could not take him to court because he is the lawgiver. He is above the law. If he says it is now law that the babies should be killed, then you can no longer say that the killing of the babies is unlawful, right? So you cannot take him personally to court, but he's also not the one killing the babies. So if he's turning to his ministers to pass on the order, or if his soldiers are to execute the order, then they, if they had a conscience, could simply say, no, this is not an order we want to execute. And while you mustn't directly refuse the sovereign, because again, if the executive could do that, if they could simply arbitrarily decide this law we want to follow, this law we think is a good law, and this law we think is a bad law that we don't want to follow, then the sovereign would not be sovereign, but rather the executive would be sovereign. Then the executive would have the highest power, would be the overlord. So while they cannot outright refuse the law as the executive, as individuals they could refuse being the executive. So a minister being tasked with an unjust order or law, or let's say a policeman, a soldier being tasked with something unjust, could simply step down and say, well, with my conscience, I don't want to do that. So Kant does not want people to be like certain Nazis like Eichmann, saying, oh, we just followed orders, it's not our responsible. Rather, he wants people to be aufklärt enough to think and judge for themselves and to follow their own conscience. And if we assume that everyone was good, so if we assume that the person getting an unjust order steps down, and then someone else is put in his place, but he also doesn't want to follow that order and also steps down, and so on, then the sovereign could give the most unjust orders ever, but he would simply find no one to execute them. So he would have to eventually accept that this is not gonna happen, and he would have to eventually change his orders. So you would never need to dethrone him. You would never need to put him in front of court, which again, according to Kant, cannot happen if he is truly sovereign, if he truly is the overlord, because then there is no power above him that could take his power away or that could judge him. But all you need to do is make him and make his unjust orders harmless by simply everyone refusing to follow them if they are unjust, by simply everyone stepping down. So you can note here that Kant tries in a clever way to deal with the absolutism of his time, right? He tries to find a way to keep the absolute monarch in place, to not need to abolish absolutism, to not need to have a revolution, but to render him harmless, to make sure he can no longer, even if he would like to, act as a despot. The reason for that is not because Kant necessarily supports absolutism. No, Kant would have preferred a system of representation, as he says, so some sort of parliament, some sort of letting people also vote. But well, that simply wasn't the case back then. And Kant accepts sort of the given situation and tries to work with it. He tries to ask, okay, given what we are given, how can we make this as just as possible? Which I think is an important note to make, because Kant is an idealist, and nowadays the word idealism is often abused and misunderstood, and there are many people who would think that the idealist is a naive dreamer who dreams of some unrealistic utopia, right? Idealism is often taken to be the opposite of realism, but that is not the case. You will find that the idealist philosophers like Kant or like Fichte are also the most realistic, that they have a very clear sense of reality and in their own way a very pragmatic outlook of reality. Realism is not the opposite of idealism, it necessarily corresponds with idealism. All that the idealist is asking for is not to completely ignore reality or pretend that it isn't there or pretend that you can just magically change everything. The idealist would say, look at what the real conditions are, what you are working with, look what you can do with that. All he is asking for is to not be unaufklärt, to not live with this victim mentality, that is to not be a slave of reality, as if this reality was set in stone and could not be changed. but rather to always have your ideal in mind and to always to work with reality, but to work with it according to the ideal. So in other words, taking up Kant's division between ruling and governing again, you could say that the idealist says, okay, let reality rule, but be independent, be aufklärt enough to govern reality. But this is just part of the solution, what I explained so far, because yes, Kant wants this full separation of powers, where the sovereign is indeed only the lawgiver. So even if he was not religious, even if he was not conscientious, even if he was giving bad laws, since he does not enact it, those who are tasked with enacting it could still have a conscience and could still step down rather than enact it. But of course, Kant does not want to depend simply on the conscience of some ministers or of some state officials or of policemen or whatever. Kant is not so naive as to not know that a despot would always find some willing bootlicker that will do his bidding. Again, Kant's whole point is we need to construct the state in a manner that makes it run smoothly and that makes justice possible, even if it is a state of devils. It must not be a state that requires people to be angels. So the question is, what if the sovereign is a devil? And the answer that Kant gives sort of is, well, if the powers are sufficiently separated, then the sovereign can be a devil as long as the government is not made up of devils, then they will not execute the devilish evil orders. But if this was the only answer, then this would mean, okay, we don't require the sovereign to be an angel, but we require the people in the government to be angels. What now if they too are devils? What if they have no conscience? Well, here Kant reminds us that, according to him, the sovereign is the overlord. He is above the law because he gives the law, so he cannot be judged by the law. But this is not true for the people in the executive branch and in the judiciary. They can be judged by the law. So, meaning even the highest position beneath the sovereign, so the ministers and even the prime minister or chancellor or even the king, if we call the head of government the king, again, like in England, even he can be judged according to the laws if he does an injustice. So again, let's take the biblical example. Let's say the king gives this order, kill the babies. The king cannot be dragged in front of court by the mothers of Bethlehem if he is a sovereign king. But the ministers who execute that order, the soldiers who execute that order, they could be dragged in front of court for murder in the ideal state as Kant envisions it. And if they know that beforehand, then maybe even if they don't have a conscience, but simply self-interest, once again, they will probably step down from their positions because they know that they are responsible for their actions and they can be judged for their actions. So that is Kant's point. The sovereign as such cannot and mustn't be judged. And I think this becomes even more clear if we don't think of the sovereign as an absolute monarch, but rather if we think of democracy, of the people, right? You cannot possibly, whatever laws are given, whatever government is elected, you cannot possibly accuse the people as a whole and put the people as a whole in front of court. It makes no sense, because all power comes from the people. There is no power above the people that could judge the people. But whatever the people elected, even if the people are as a majority evil, even if they did elect, let's say, a racist government, that government is not sovereign. That government can be judged for its actions. And that government and all that are part of the executive or the judiciary must answer for their actions. As long as that is the case, that will maybe prevent them from enacting the worst orders, the worst laws that the sovereign gives. So what Kant proposes here is to create a sort of fiction, to pretend as if the sovereign was perfect, even if he is an imperfect human in truth, and therefore pretend that all laws, all orders he gives are just. And so therefore, if an injustice happens in the state, we should never accuse the sovereign of having been unjust, but rather those who actually did it, who actually enacted it, should be treated as if they had only misinterpreted the will of the sovereign. This is indeed what has been done in certain historical cases, right? Like think of Japan, for example. There, the sovereign historically would be the emperor. But the emperor, of course, a lot of the time was quite powerless. The actual day-to-day power lay with the shogun. The shogun would be if we think of this in Kant's terms, then the shogun would be the governor or the rector, right? The head of the executive branch. And if any sort of injustice was done, then it was not done directly by the emperor, but by the shogun. Let's say in theory that the shogun is doing what the emperor also wants to happen. Let's say in theory that they are in full agreement. Still, no one would accuse the emperor. Everyone would act as if the error lay with the shogun, and is as if the shogun, by committing this injustice, had acted against the emperor's will and had sort of rebelled. Which maybe gives people even the right to replace the shogun, to rebel against him, but not see it as a rebellion, but rather see it as enforcing the true will of the emperor, as putting down the shogun's rebellion, right? This is precisely what happened in the Meiji Restoration. And even after World War II, this is basically how the emperor was saved, right? It was on the table to abolish the monarchy. The Americans talked about abolishing the monarchy and about punishing, about potentially executing the emperor as a war criminal. But the Japanese managed to work with this maybe legal fiction. They managed to say, well, the emperor was not responsible for this whole war. The emperor always wanted peace, and the responsible people are the people who governed under the emperor, are the people that the emperor put in place to govern. they betrayed the emperor, or they misunderstood the emperor, and they enacted his will in an unlawful manner. So they can be punished now as war criminals, but the emperor can stay in place. And this is not just what happens in the Japanese monarchy. This is also in our democracies. How we deal ideally with the constitution. We pretend as if the constitution was perfect. Of course, we know that the constitution was written by human beings who were imperfect, who were probably not completely just. But we try to act as if their will had been fully just, and as if any errors of the day-to-day legislative or executive or judiciary were their errors and not errors of the original sovereign lawgiver. So let's say you turn to the Supreme Court of your country, to the Constitutional Court, to complain about some law being unconstitutional. Maybe the people who gave the Constitution originally would actually have agreed with that law, but we pretend as if they still didn't want it. So let's take homosexuality. So here in Germany, the Constitution says everyone is equal. No one must be discriminated against. Nowadays, if a homosexual person feels that some law discriminates against him, he can go to our Constitutional Court, and the court will probably rule in his favor. So the court will act as if indeed this law discriminating homosexuals was against the Constitution. Now, is this what the people who gave the Constitution directly after World War II had in mind? I don't think so. This was the end of the 40s. This was still a quite conservative time. Indeed, we know that they did not have, when they talked about equality, that they did not have homosexuals in mind, because back then there were laws prohibiting homosexual acts. It was still illegal until the 70s. So if they had been against this, against homosexuality being prohibited, then they would have abolished these earlier laws from the Nazi time, from the time of the German Empire, that criminalized homosexuality. They didn't. So we know that the fathers of our Constitution did not intend for homosexuals to be equal. But nowadays, the courts would not say, oh, well, our Constitution is unjust. Our Constitution does talk about equality, but maybe the equality is meant to be equality between races, right? Like right after the Second World War, of course, they meant equality between Germans and Jews, for example. Or maybe it's about equality between sexes, but no one had in mind equality between sexual orientations. So, yeah, this is unjust, but our Constitution is unjust. No, we would not say that. Rather, nowadays, the Constitutional Court would work with this fiction, sort of, as if the Constitution had always meant for homosexuals also to be equal, and as if all those times where the discriminating law had been in place, that had been against what the Constitution wanted. So we would act as if the error was not with those who gave the Constitution. Of course it was. Of course they were not for equality for gay people. But rather as if the error was with the government and the way it had misinterpreted the will of those who put the constitution in place. And of course, over time, those interpretations could change, right? Like now we have legalized homosexuality. Still in Germany, incest is illegal. This is not the case in every state, right? You just have to step across the border to France. In France, for 200 years, since the time of Napoleon, incest is legal. In Germany, it's still illegal. Of course, there's no rational reason for that. Of course, there's no reason why, let's say, consensual sex between a brother and a sister should be illegal. There's no proper rational argument for that. If you think it should be illegal, you simply are an unaufclared person, not thinking for themselves, but following whatever society dictates, just mindlessly following whatever is socially acceptable. I mean, you can say, if you want, that you find this gross, the sort of brother and sister engaged in sexual activity, but then there's also many people thinking that gay sex is gross. Your personal feelings of disgust should not rule over others. Rather, as I explained in previous lectures, the state should guarantee people freedom, and it should only restrict their freedom as much as is necessary to ensure other people's freedom. Well, if people have the freedom to have consensual sex, even if they are both men or even if they are both related, this does not infringe on your freedom. So there is no rational argument against that. Still, there has been a case here in Germany of a brother and sister that were engaged in a sexual relationship and that got punished for that according to the law. And they took this to the Constitutional Court, but the court ruled against them. They said that this discrimination was not unconstitutional. And of course, here, all you can see is that the judges too are people of their time and are people ruled by the sensibilities and by the prejudices of their time. So, but I would say it's entirely possible, of course, that if the attitudes in society changed, I mean, think of what the attitudes of society were towards homosexuality just a few decades ago. Things can change. And then someone was again to turn towards the Constitutional Court. Then maybe now the court would say, yes, this is unconstitutional. The prohibition of incest must be abolished. This would not mean that the Constitution has changed. And this would not mean that the original will of those who wrote the Constitution has changed. I'm quite convinced that just like they did not intend for homosexuals to be equal, they did not intend for incest to be legal. And again, if they had intended for that, they would probably have made it so when writing the laws, writing the Constitution. But there would be nothing preventing us from interpreting the Constitution in that way, even though we would know that it was not originally meant to be interpreted in that way. This also goes back, I gave a lecture before about what Kant says about how we should read a text, like a philosophical text, and Kant is always saying the important question is not the historical question, what did the author intend, but rather the question, what should he have intended? So we should not interpret it simply according to what he wanted, because he was human and therefore he could have made an error in thinking, but rather we should interpret it in a rational manner. We should ask what is the most rational interpretation that is possible. So what is the interpretation that makes this author right? Maybe he himself was wrong. Maybe he, with his words, meant something that is wrong. But can his words be understood in another manner so that they would be right? Likewise, Kant would say, maybe the sovereign in giving a law was wrong, maybe he was unjust, but we should pretend as if he is always just. So we should ask, or rather the government should ask, can we interpret these laws in a manner that make them just laws? And again, if the government doesn't do this, if the government does something unjust, even if it is in line with what the sovereign actually wanted, we should pretend as if they acted against the sovereign's will, and we should accuse them for that, and we should put them in front of court for that, and we should punish them for that. And that is precisely what should motivate them to only interpret the laws in a just manner. And this is how it should work in all situations, not according to Kant, not just when it comes to laws. So, for example, Kant also talks about how the sovereign should not be engaged in any sort of trade or commerce or contracts, because again, the sovereign should always only deal with the whole. Because if you deal with the whole and if you at the same time represent the will of the whole, then you cannot do an injustice. But as soon as you deal with a particular, you can do an injustice. So therefore, the people who have the sovereignty, let's say once again you have an absolute monarch, this monarch should not enter contracts as a private person with other private persons, right? If that monarch were to, let's say, buy a house, or if that monarch were to do something else of that manner, then he would enter normal legal relationships with other people, and here legal conflicts could arise, right? So again, the monarch could be accused of an injustice. Small, simple things like if he owns some real estate as a private person, then there could be a conflict with his neighbor about where exactly the fence between their lands should run or whatever. And then the neighbor could take him to court. But again, the sovereign, according to Kant, must be perfect, must be holy, and must be above the law because he gives it, so he cannot be taken to court. How does Kant solve this? Well, once again, Kant says someone else can work for the sovereign. So, sure, Kant is aware that the sovereign is still a human being with human needs, but Kant would say, if, let's say, the king wants to buy a house, he should tell one of his servants, one of his ministers, and then not he, the king, should buy the house, but rather the minister should buy the house for him. And so again, if a conflict arises, like let's say the agreed upon sum is not paid in time, then the person with whom a contract was made, so the person who sold the house, should not deal with the sovereign and should not take the sovereign to court, but rather this servant or this minister. Even if, in truth, the servant has done exactly what the sovereign wanted, if an injustice was done, it should be treated as if the servant just somehow misunderstood the sovereign's will, as if the sovereign as such did not want anything wrong, and just the servant did go about the wrong way. And since that is the case, since not the sovereign will have to answer for his orders, but rather those who execute those orders, since they will be treated as if they did this on their own, since they will not be able to say, oh, I only followed orders, and since they will probably find themselves in prison for doing some injustice, again, that should motivate them to not mindlessly follow the sovereign's orders, but to either interpret them in a harmless manner or if it cannot be done, to step down so that they don't have to follow those orders. And that is precisely how you prevent, according to Kant, the sovereign from doing an injustice. So again, the government should be between the sovereign and the state. Kant, for example, uses this image. He says, a master who owns a carriage, sure, he will find a servant to drive the carriage. He will also buy horses for the carriage. And he will check on the servant. He will inspect that the servant does things right. If he finds that the servant mistreats the horses, he will replace him with somebody else. And of course, he will give the order where to drive. But he can sit in the carriage. He does not have to drive himself. He does not have to sit in front and directly deal with the horses or whatever. There can be a separation. And this is how Kant tries to make sure that even though there is a sovereign power in the state, even though we do have laws according to which everything else is judged, but which and whose lawgiver themselves cannot be judged, we still ensure that the whole thing does not turn despotic. We still ensure, by separating the lawgiver and the executioner, and by making sure that while the lawgiver cannot be judged, the executioner can, we ensure that the whole thing does not turn into despotism, but ideally is a state that is governed, even if not ruled, in a republican manner. And indeed, this is somewhat how we do it and how we must do it, even more so if the sovereign is the people and not simply a monarch. Like, no matter how big the crimes might be that are committed, they must then be treated as crimes of the government, for which the people of the government are punished, right? Like we punished the leading Nazis as war criminals, or now we have arrest warrants against Netanyahu and against his war minister Gallant. But we must then treat those people as if they had misinterpreted the will of their people who originally voted them into power. Maybe the people actually aren't that innocent. I mean, the German people supported the Nazis. The Israeli people largely are pro-genocide. But what can you do if you want to keep the state and the laws as such intact? You must treat the lawgiver as being above the law, because only through him there is a state and there are laws. And so the responsibility must lie with the government, and you simply must construct a way in the state in such a way that indeed the government will be held responsible, so as to make sure that the people in power would think twice about whether they should really follow the sovereign's will if it is an unjust will. So that is what Kant has to say about the separation in powers and about sovereignty. And now I have already mentioned that to him there are two forms of government, the despotic and the republican government, and that all of this is meant to make sure that the government is republican. This, of course, leads directly to the question, what does that mean precisely? What is, to Kant, the difference between despotism and a republic? And this is exactly what I want to discuss next. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk-Kubilay Altu, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.